They say out west of the Black Hills the land holds its breath, that it's a place of hard truths and even harder ground, where the sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer and the wind scrapes you raw. In 1887, for a 13-year-old boy named Arthur, this wasn't a land of promise. It was a prison. He was an orphan, a piece of driftwood left behind after the fever took his folks 2 winters back. He lived in the cracks of the world, in a collapsed lean-to behind the old livery stable, a ghost haunting the edge of a town called Redemption Creek. A town whose name felt like a mean joke. The folks there didn't see a boy. They saw a problem, a stray to be shooed away, a walking, talking reminder of how fragile their own lives were. So he learned the quiet ways. He learned to read the story told by a bent twig, to understand the secret language of the dust. He knew the jackrabbit's favorite paths and the grouse's hiding spots. His life was a silent routine, measured by the ache in his belly and the slow turn of the seasons. He was invisible, and for a boy alone, invisibility was a shield. His days were simple. Wake before the sun, check the snares, and hope. Hope for a rabbit, a quail, anything. Hope to avoid the town sheriff, Garrett Shaw, a man whose stare felt like a fist. Then he'd retreat to the creek, the only place that felt like his. The rustle of cottonwood leaves was a kinder sound than any human voice he knew. It was a life of silence, a life that had put a permanent watchfulness in his young eyes. But one afternoon when the sun hung in the sky like a hot brass coin, everything changed. He was downstream, further than usual, hoping for a fish in a deep pool. The air was thick, buzzing with insects, and then he heard it, a sound that cut right through the hum. It was a low, guttural noise, a desperate choke sound. It wasn't an animal. His instincts, the ones that had kept him alive for 2 years, screamed at him to run. Trouble in this land was a predator, and he'd always survived by being small, silent, and unseen. But something else, some flicker of a feeling he'd long since buried, held him there. He moved like a shadow, his bare feet silent on the dry earth. He crept through a thicket of willows peering through the leaves, and the sight that met his eyes snatched the breath right out of his lungs. The creek had carved out a treacherous bend here, a wide, wet scar of shimmering mud. It was quicksand, and in the middle of it, sunk to her waist, was a woman. She was Lakota. Her dark hair was matted with mud, her deerskin dress heavy and stained. She was clawing at the soupy earth with one hand, her other pressed tight against her side. With every tiny panicked movement, the sand pulled her deeper. It was a slow, merciless drowning. He saw an eagle feather, a sacred thing, tangled in her hair, caked and pathetic. But there was something else. Her leg, the one still caught, was bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. It wasn't just the sand holding her. Something had broken it. Something had sent her tumbling into this trap. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The people of Redemption Creek spoke of the Lakota like they were devils, savages that haunted the edges of their world. He'd been fed a diet of fear his whole life. Sheriff Shaw would call him a fool for even looking. The whole town would turn on him. He should run. He should just melt back into the trees and forget he ever saw a thing. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But he couldn't. He didn't see a savage. He saw a person drowning in mud. He saw the same terror he felt in his own heart on the coldest nights, when the loneliness was so big it felt like it would swallow him whole. Her struggle wasn't a story. It was real, and it cut through all the lies he'd ever been told. For a long, silent moment, the orphan boy and the sinking woman were the only two people in the world, caught in a nightmare. And in that moment, Arthur made a choice that would change the West forever. He pushed aside the willows and stepped out into the open. He was done being a ghost. The woman's head snapped toward the sound. Her dark eyes went wide with a fresh wave of terror. She saw a scrawny white boy in tattered clothes, a creature from the world that had stolen her people's land. Her body went stiff. She stopped struggling, bracing herself for whatever cruelty was coming next. Arthur held up his hands, palms open. It was the only language he had. I'll help, he said, his voice a rusty croak. He hadn't spoken to another person in weeks. He knew he couldn't just walk in after her. The quicksand was greedy. it would take him too. His mind raced, clicking through the problems of survival like it always did. He scanned the creek bank. A deadfall cottonwood lay nearby, its branches bleached bone white by the sun. He ran to it, his bare feet not even feeling the sharp stones. He put his shoulder against a long, sturdy limb and pushed. He grunted, his thin muscles screaming as he worked it free. It was heavy, almost too heavy, but then he saw her sink another inch, and a surge of adrenaline gave him a strength he didn't know he had. He dragged the branch to the edge of the mire, shoving it out across the surface toward her. "Take it!" he yelled, his voice stronger now. "Grab on!" She just stared at the branch, then back at him. Her eyes were filled with a fierce, burning suspicion. Trust was a coin neither of them had ever been given. To her, a white hand offering help could be a trick, a final, terrible lie. To him, every second he stood in the open was a risk. He could see the war in her eyes. "Please," he said, the words soft but urgent. "It'll pull you down." Her gaze lingered on his face, searching for the lie. Maybe she saw something in his scared, honest eyes. Maybe she saw that he was just as broken as she was. Slowly her hand reached out. It trembled, her fingers stretching, until they brushed the wood. She wrapped her hand around it. Her grip was like iron. "Pull when I say," Arthur instructed, a strange authority in his voice. He laid his body flat on the solid ground, digging his toes into the dirt for leverage. He took his end of the branch. "Now!" He pulled. The branch bowed. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. He could feel the incredible sucking power of the mud. It was like trying to pull a root from the center of the earth. The woman cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, as the movement jarred her shattered leg. He gritted his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes, and pulled again, throwing every last ounce of his wiry frame into it. He felt a small give, a tiny shift. The seal was breaking. "Again!" he shouted, more to himself than to her. He pulled and she pulled. Their struggle was a silent, straining battle against the earth itself. The mud slurped and groaned, reluctantly, angrily, releasing its grip. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged her toward the bank. Her body was a dead weight, scraping through the silt. When her torso was finally clear, he scrambled to her side, grabbed her under the arms, and hauled her the last few feet onto the grass. She collapsed, gasping for air, her body trembling with shock and exhaustion, caked in a second skin of mud. Arthur stumbled back, his own body shaking, his lungs on fire. He had done it. He had pulled her from the earth's greedy mouth. And now a new fear, a colder and more complicated fear, began to creep in. He had saved her. But what in God's name was he supposed to do now? She pushed herself up onto her elbows, every movement stiff and pained. Her eyes met his and the fear was gone. In its place was a deep, bottomless exhaustion and a flicker of something else, a cautious, weary appraisal. She was alive, but she was hurt, and they were alone together at the edge of a world that wanted them both dead. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the mud that clung to her skin. Arthur stood there, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving a hollow ache behind. He knew the risk he'd taken. She was Lakota. He was white. In the harsh math of the frontier, that was all that was supposed to matter. The woman tried to sit up, but a sharp hiss of pain escaped her lips. She looked down at her right leg, still half buried at the edge of the bank. Arthur followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. Her ankle was twisted at a grotesque angle, swollen and purple. It was broken, badly. She was grounded, helpless. His survival instinct, the one honed by 2 years of bitter solitude, screamed at him to leave. He'd done his part. He'd saved her. Now he should just disappear back into the trees and let her people find her. It was the only sensible thing to do. But he couldn't move. Leaving her here, injured and exposed, felt like a different kind of killing. A betrayal of the strange, fragile bond they just forged in mud and desperation. He took a hesitant step closer and pointed at her ankle. "Broke?" he asked. The single word felt stupid and small. She gave a short, sharp nod, her jaw tight with pain. She wouldn't look at him. Her pride was a wall around her. Even now, she would not ask this boy for anything more. Arthur's mind was a whirlwind. He couldn't take her to town. Sheriff Shaw would lock her up, or worse. The townsfolk, their fear stirred up like a hornet's nest, might form a mob. He was on his own, which meant he had to take her to the only sanctuary he had in the world, the derelict lean-to he called home. The thought was terrifying. It was one thing to help a stranger in a crisis. It was another thing to bring the crisis home with you, to invite the storm right into your house. He looked at her again, at the lines of pain etched around her eyes, at the stoic set of her mouth. He saw a strength that made his own fear feel small and cowardly. She wasn't an enemy. She was just a woman who was hurt and alone, just like him. "I have a place," he said quietly, the words surprising even himself. "It ain't much, but it's dry, safe." She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing his offer. He could see the doubt, the deep-seated mistrust warring with the brutal reality of her situation. He waited, feeling like his own fate was hanging on her decision as much as hers was. After a long moment that felt like an hour, she gave another small, almost invisible nod. Getting her there was a nightmare. He found another branch for a crutch, and with him supporting most of her weight, they began the slow, agonizing journey away from the creek. Every step was a fresh wave of pain for her, and he could feel her tremors right through his own thin frame. They didn't speak. They didn't know each other's names. The only language between them was the rhythm of her pained breathing and his grunts of effort. It was a pilgrimage of two outcasts, moving through a land that hated them both. His shelter wasn't much more than a pile of scavenged planks propped against a rock outcropping, hidden from the main trail by a thick stand of pines. It was pathetic, but it was his. He helped her inside, easing her down onto his bed, a pile of dry leaves covered with a threadbare blanket. The tiny space smelled of dust and old wood smoke. He built a small, smokeless fire just outside the entrance, his hands moving with the sure, familiar motions of survival. He fetched water from a hidden spring and brought it to her. She drank deeply, her eyes closing for a moment in relief. He looked at her ankle again. The swelling was worse, the skin stretched tight and discolored. He knew from setting snares and seeing injured animals that a break had to be set, or it would heal all wrong, leaving her crippled forever. He had no idea how to do that for a person, but he had a hazy memory, a ghost of a memory from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, of his father splinting the leg of a calf. "I have to," he began, gesturing toward the injury. "It needs to be straight." She understood immediately. He saw a flicker of fear across her face, but she masked it with that same iron will. She lay back, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the blanket. Arthur's hands trembled as he took her foot. The skin was cool and damp. He took a deep breath, trying to see his father's confident hands in his mind's eye. He pulled, gently but firmly. A terrible strangled cry was torn from her throat. Her entire body arched in pure agony. He felt a sickening pop as the bones shifted, and for a horrifying second, he thought he had made it 1,000 times worse. He let go, scrambling back, his face pale. But when he dared to look again, the angle was better. The worst of the unnatural twist was gone. She lay panting, sweat beading on her forehead, but the rigid line of her jaw had softened. He hadn't failed. He found 2 flat pieces of wood and tore strips from his own shirt to make a crude splint, binding it as tightly as he dared. For the next 3 days, a strange, quiet rhythm settled over the lean-to. Arthur foraged and hunted with a new urgency. He was no longer just feeding himself. He was providing for 2. He'd returned to find her watching him, her gaze intense and unreadable. Their communication was sparse, made of gestures and single words. He learned that a slight nod meant, "Thank you." He learned that a certain look in her eye meant the pain was bad. On the second day, she spoke for the first time. He'd brought her a tea made from willow bark, something he knew helped with fever and pain. As he handed her the tin cup, her fingers brushed his. She looked right at him. "Winona," she said, her voice soft but clear. She touched her own chest. "Arthur," he replied, startled. The exchange of names felt like a treaty being signed. A fragile bridge had been built across the chasm that separated their 2 worlds. He started to see her not just as an injury to be tended, but as a person. He noticed the way she'd watched the birds flitting outside the shelter, her expression wistful. He saw the innate grace in her hands as she rebraided her long, dark hair. One afternoon, she pointed to the herbs he was sorting, and using a mix of her language and gestures, she showed him which ones were better for a poultice and which could be used for a soothing wash. He was the provider, but she was the one with the knowledge. A quiet respect began to grow in him. Winona, in turn, observed the boy. She saw the poverty of his life, the worn-out clothes, the gnawing hunger he tried to hide, the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. But she also saw his strength, his surprising competence in this brutal world. And most importantly, she saw his kindness. He had saved her without hesitation. He had tended to her with a gentleness that didn't belong in a place like this. He shared his meager food without a second thought. In his weary, guarded eyes, she saw not the hatred of her enemies, but the deep, unhealed wound of a child who had lost everything. The prejudice she had carried in her own heart, a shield built from a lifetime of pain and broken promises, began to melt away. This boy was not like the others. The silence between them became comfortable. Sometimes as he mended a snare outside, he would feel her eyes on him. When he looked up, she would offer a small, faint smile. It was a gift more precious than food or water. For the first time in 2 years, Arthur felt seen. He was no longer a ghost. He was Arthur, and he had a friend named Winona. He started to feel a fierce, protective instinct swell in his chest. This broken-down shelter had become a sanctuary for them both, a tiny island of peace in a hostile world. But their island was not safe, and the outside world was coming for them. On the morning of the fourth day, the world intruded. Arthur was returning from his traps, a skinny squirrel dangling from his hand, when he heard it. The sound of horses, not on the main trail but moving through the woods. Methodically, like they were searching. His blood ran cold. He dropped into a crouch, his heart hammering against his ribs. It couldn't be the sheriff. This was too far off the path. He crept back to the edge of the clearing and peered through the pines. 3 Lakota warriors on horseback were moving in a line, their eyes sweeping the ground. One of them, a man with a face like carved granite, reined in his horse. He had found their tracks. He pointed, and the other 2 converged. They were coming right for the shelter. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Arthur. They would see him as a kidnapper, a white boy who had harmed one of their own. They wouldn't ask questions. Their justice would be swift and final. He scrambled back to the lean-to, his face ashen. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Your people." Winona heard the terror in his voice and pushed herself up, her face tense. She listened, and her expression changed. It wasn't fear he saw. It was a complex mix of relief and, concern. She looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. "Do not be afraid, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and steady. But he was terrified. The lead warrior dismounted. He moved with a fluid, dangerous grace, a long knife sheathed at his hip. He walked directly to the entrance of the lean-to, his companions flanking him, their faces grim and suspicious. The warrior's eyes fell on Arthur, who stood frozen in the opening, a small, terrified boy standing between him and whatever lay inside. The warrior's gaze was hard, cold, and filled with a lethal promise. He took a step forward, his hand moving toward the hilt of his knife. Arthur flinched, bracing himself for the blow that was about to fall. "Chatan, stop!" The voice came from inside the shelter. It was Winona's voice, but it was different. It held an authority Arthur had never heard before. It was not a plea. It was a command. The warrior Chatan froze instantly. His head snapped up, his hard expression melting into disbelief, then profound relief. He pushed past Arthur, as if the boy wasn't even there, and knelt at Winona's side, speaking to her in the rapid, low tones of their language. Arthur stood by, trembling, as the other 2 warriors gathered around. Their initial hostility toward him was replaced by a confused reverence for the scene inside. They weren't just looking for a lost member of their tribe. The way they spoke to her, the way they looked at her, it was something more. It was like they were looking at something holy. Chatan turned his gaze back to Arthur. The suspicion was gone, but a deep, searching question remained. Winona spoke again, her voice soft but firm, and her eyes never left Arthur's face. She was telling them what had happened. She was telling them his story. Chatan listened, his granite face unreadable, but his eyes kept flicking from her splinted leg to the boy's ragged form. When she finished, a deep silence fell over the small clearing. A fragile peace seemed to settle. But in the dust of Redemption Creek, peace doesn't last long. A new sound shattered the quiet, the crash of heavy boots and the loud, booming voice of a white man. "All right, you savages, hold it right there." Sheriff Garrett Shaw burst into the clearing, his shotgun leveled. And behind him were 5 townsmen, a hastily formed posse, armed with rifles in a self-righteous fury. Someone must have seen Arthur's tracks leading off the trail. To them, the scene was exactly what they expected. The poor orphan boy, cornered by a band of hostile natives, and they had come to deliver their own brand of redemption. The clearing was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. On one side stood Sheriff Shaw and his posse, their faces a mask of fear and grim determination. On the other, Chaitan and his 2 warriors, their bodies coiled like springs, their expressions cold with a resolve hardened by 1,000 battles. Entrapped in the middle, in the eye of the storm, was Arthur. "I said, give us the boy," Shaw bellowed, his voice a ragged bark. "He's a ward of this town. You've got no claim on him." Chaitan let out a low, dangerous growl. He didn't speak English, but he understood the language of threat perfectly. His hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. Arthur's mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to become the ghost he had always been. This was a fight between men, between forces far greater than him. But then he glanced back at Winona. He saw her face, pale but resolute. He remembered the feeling of her hand gripping the branch, the quiet trust they had built in this small, sacred space. He had promised her it was safe. Something inside him snapped. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was joined by something else, something hot and fierce. It was courage. He took a step forward, out of the shadows and into the charged space between the 2 groups. He was just a boy, small and scrawny, but as he planted his feet, he seemed to cast a shadow far larger than his frame. "He's wrong," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. Every eye swiveled to him. "Son, you don't have to be scared," Sheriff Shaw said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're here to help you. Just step aside." "No," Arthur said, shaking his head. He stood his ground, placing himself squarely between the sheriff's shotgun and Winona. "You don't understand. She was hurt. In the quicksand. Her leg, it's broken. I pulled her out. I brought her here." He pointed a trembling finger at Chatan. "They aren't hurting me. They're her people. They came to find her." His words, simple and honest, hung in the air. It was a truth so different from the story of hate and fear, everyone expected that. For a moment, no one knew what to do. A few men in the posse shifted on their feet, their certainty beginning to crack. But the sheriff's face hardened, his condescension curdling into pure rage. "You're a fool, boy, a traitor to your own kind. They've filled your head with lies. Now get out of the way before you get hurt." He raised his shotgun, gesturing with the barrel. That was when a clear, commanding voice cut through the tension like a knife. "He speaks the truth." Winona emerged from the shelter, leaning on the arm of a younger warrior. She moved with a pained grace, her back straight, her head held high. Her presence radiated an authority that had nothing to do with guns or anger. She was no longer just a woman. She was a queen. She fixed Sheriff Shaw with a gaze as steady and as ancient as the hills themselves. And then she spoke, in flawless, unaccented English, her voice completely devoid of fear. "This boy, Arthur, saved my life. When I was helpless, he showed me kindness. When I was in pain, he gave me comfort. He has more honor in his small body than you, and all your armed men possess." A stunned silence fell over the posse. They had come expecting to fight savages, to rescue a boy from a monstrous fate. They were not prepared for an eloquent, dignified woman who spoke their own language better than they did. They were not prepared for the fierce loyalty of the orphan boy they had always ignored. Shaw sputtered, his blustering authority punctured. "Now you listen here?" "No," Winona interrupted, her voice dropping to a steely quiet. "You will listen. You have come to my friend's home with guns and threats. You have judged without knowledge and condemned without reason. This boy is under my protection now. He and his home. You will leave this place." Chatan, watching the exchange, saw the courage in Arthur's stance and the power in Winona's words. He understood. The boy had not just pulled her from the mud. He had shielded her, defended her. He had become one of them in spirit. With emotion so subtle it was almost invisible, Chatan eased his hand away from his knife. It was a sign of de-escalation, a concession born of respect for the boy's bravery. The sheriff looked from Winona's immovable face to Chatan's formidable presence. Then he looked at his own men. He saw their resolve faltering. He saw doubt creeping into their eyes. He had lost. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and most importantly, he had lost the moral high ground. His righteous crusade had been exposed as a fool's errand. With a curse spat into the dirt, Shaw lowered his shotgun. "Have it your way, boy," he snarled at Arthur, his voice dripping with venom. "You've made your choice. Don't come crawling to us when your pet wolves turn on you." Then he turned and added something strange, something that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. "Your father should have learned to stay out of things that didn't concern him. Looks like you're just as stupid as he was." The sheriff turned and stomped back through the trees, his posse trailing behind him, their retreat clumsy and shamefaced. They melted back into the woods, leaving behind a silence that was no longer tense, but filled with a profound, ringing peace. The threat was gone. The battle had been won, but the sheriff's last words hung in the air, a dark and poisonous seed that had just been planted in Arthur's mind. In the quiet aftermath, the clearing felt transformed. The danger had passed, leaving a stillness that felt sacred. Chatan walked over to Arthur. The tall, formidable warrior, who had been ready to kill just moments before, now looked down at the boy with an expression of profound respect. He placed a large calloused hand on Arthur's shoulder. The gesture said more than words ever could. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It said, "You are one of us." Winona smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "You stood, Arthur," she said softly. "When all your life you were taught to run, you stood your ground. For me." He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. The adrenaline washed out of him, leaving him feeling shaky but whole. He had faced down the world that had cast him out, and he had not broken. But the sheriff's words about his father echoed in his head. What did he mean? In the days that followed, the lean-to became a place of healing. Chatan and his warriors made camp nearby, standing a silent, watchful guard. They treated Arthur with a quiet deference that bewildered him. They shared their food, showed him how to fletch an arrow, and spoke to him in gestures and smiles. He was no longer the town's stray. He was the boy who had protected their sacred woman. He learned the truth about Winona. She wasn't a queen, not in the way of white men. She was a keeper of stories, a spiritual guide, the living heart of her people's wisdom. Her people were being pushed from their lands, not by soldiers, but by a railroad company that used hired guns and broken treaties to get what it wanted. Winona was on her way to a meeting with other tribal leaders, carrying proof of the company's crimes when she was ambushed. They didn't just want to stop her, they wanted what she carried. Her attackers had broken her leg and left her for dead, never imagining she would survive. As Arthur listened, a terrible thought began to form. He remembered his father, a quiet man who had taught him the ways of the land. He remembered hushed arguments between his parents late at night, talk of injustice, of helping the people. He remembered the day the sheriff had come to tell him they were dead. A fever, Shaw had said, a terrible, fast-moving fever, had taken them both in the night. It had never felt right. His parents had been strong, healthy. Now Shaw's parting words felt less like an insult and more like a threat, a confession. "Winona," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "My father, he kept a small box, a wooden box of his papers. The sheriff gave it to me after they died, said it was all they had left, but it was empty." Winona's eyes widened. She looked at Chatan and spoke quickly in her own tongue. The warrior's face grew grim. "This railroad company," Winona said, turning back to Arthur, "they have a man in Redemption Creek, a man who silences anyone who gets in their way, a man who wears a star." The world tilted under Arthur's feet. Garrett Shaw, It wasn't just a random hatred of the Lakota. It was business. And his parents, they hadn't died of a fever. They had been silenced. Just like the men who ambushed Winona. They were all connected. The lean-to, Arthur whispered, his mind racing. This wasn't my first home. We lived in a small cabin, just north of here. It burned down right after they died. Shaw said it was a lamp accident. He looked around at the ramshackle shelter he had built from scavenged wood. But some of the wood, it was different. Older, smoother. Planks he'd pulled from the ruins of his old cabin. Planks his father had cut and planed with his own hands. He ran to the back wall of the lean-to, his heart pounding. There was one plank wider than the others, set low to the ground. He'd always thought it was just part of the foundation, but now he saw a small notch at the edge, almost invisible. His fingers scrambled at it, prying it loose. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space was a small, flat object wrapped in oilskin. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely untie the knot. He unwrapped it. It was a leather-bound journal, his father's journal. He opened it. His father's neat, careful handwriting filled the pages. It was all there. A record of payments, names, dates. A detailed account of how the railroad company, with Sheriff Shaw as their enforcer, was systematically driving the Lakota from their land, murdering anyone who resisted. His father had been gathering proof, planning to take it to the federal marshals. He had been working with Winona's people. He was their ally. The last entry was dated the night he died. Shaw suspects. He was watching the cabin today. I've hidden this book. If anything happens to me, it is for Arthur. He must get it to the people. They are our only hope. Arthur looked up, his eyes blurred with tears. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had been trying to build a better world for him. He had died a hero, and Garrett Shaw had murdered him. Just then, one of the young warriors gave a sharp whistle from the trees. A warning. Arthur looked up and saw a lone rider approaching. It was Sheriff Shaw coming back. But he wasn't coming for a fight. He was carrying a white flag of truce. "I need to talk to the boy," Shaw yelled, stopping his horse at the edge of the clearing. "Alone." Chatan looked at Arthur, his hand resting on his knife. Arthur gave a small nod. He tucked the journal into his shirt. He had to know why. He walked out to meet the sheriff, his father's words burning in his heart. Shaw dismounted, his face a mess of sweat and desperation. "Listen, boy," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't understand what you're mixed up in. That woman has lied to you. Her people are dangerous. They're involved in something big, something that'll get you killed." "Like my father?" Arthur asked, his voice cold as ice. The sheriff flinched. "That was an accident. The fever?" "There was no fever," Arthur said, pulling the journal from his shirt. He held it up. "My father kept records, as sheriff, of everything." Shaw's face went white. The mask of authority crumbled, revealing the desperate, greedy man underneath. "That book, that was supposed to have burned with the cabin. I searched for it for days." "You murdered them," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash. "You killed my mother and my father in their sleep, and then you burned their house down to hide it." "They were traitors," Shaw snarled, his composure gone. "They were helping savages stand in the way of progress. That land is worth a fortune. It was my right." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the journal. "Give me the book, boy. We can walk away from this. I'll set you up, give you more money than you've ever dreamed of. No one ever has to know." "I know," Arthur said simply, "and Winona knows, and her people know." "Then you're all dead." Shaw lunged for him, his hands clawing for the journal. He was bigger, stronger, but Arthur was quick. He sidestepped, and Shaw stumbled past him. In that moment, Chatan and the other two warriors stepped out from the trees, their weapons drawn, silent as death. Shaw spun around, his hand flying to the pistol at his hip. He never had a chance. Chatan's knife was a blur of motion. The sheriff choked, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He staggered back, clutching his throat, and collapsed into the dust. He was dead before he hit the ground. Justice, swift and final, had come to Redemption Creek. The silence that followed was heavy. The reign of terror was over. The truth had finally come out. Not in a courtroom, but here, in the dirt, under the watchful eyes of the pines. Arthur looked down at the man who had taken everything from him, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction, just a vast, empty sadness. Chotten came and stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder once more. He didn't need to speak. The gesture was enough. He was not alone anymore. When Winona's ankle was strong enough for travel, they constructed a travois to carry her. The time had come for them to leave. The morning of their departure was crisp and bright. Winona called Arthur to her side. "The journal your father kept. It is the final piece of proof we need," she said. "It will save our land. Your father's courage will live on, Arthur." She looked toward the horizon. "We are returning to our winter camp. It is a place of family, of belonging. There is a place for you there. A home." She held out her hand. "Come with us." Arthur looked at her, at Chatan, at the others. He saw in their faces an offer of everything he had ever been denied: a family, a purpose, a place to belong. He looked back at his pitiful lean-to, a monument to his loneliness, and then at the vast open land where their camp lay. The world had always seen him as an orphan, a piece of nothing, but a simple choice to help a stranger in the mud had changed everything. It had led him to the truth. It had led him to justice. It had led him home. He was no longer Arthur, the forgotten boy. He was Arthur, the friend of Winona, the son of a hero, the boy who stood his ground. He looked at the path leading back toward the hostile silence of Redemption Creek, and then at the trail leading away with the Lakota. He had been alone for so long. He did not want to be alone anymore. A slow smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile of his young life. He turned to face his new family, ready to walk toward the rising sun. He had found his home, not in a place of wood and nails, but in the shelter of a bond forged in mud, tested by fire, and built on the unshakable foundation of unexpected kindness. If you enjoyed this story of hidden secrets and unlikely heroes, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. And let us know in the comments, what do you think was the single bravest thing Arthur did? Thanks for watching.